Welcome. Today we are looking at 5 recent headlines shaping the conversation around gender in America. Each of these stories touches sports, healthcare, the military, and even classrooms, and together they paint a picture of a country still working out where the lines should fall. Let's start with the biggest legal story of the summer. On June 30th, the Supreme Court upheld state laws barring transgender girls and women from competing on school sports teams. In a 6-3 decision written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the court ruled that laws in West Virginia and Idaho do not violate the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. And in a striking twist, the justices agreed unanimously, including the 3 liberal justices, that these bans do not violate Title IX either, since the federal law already permits sex-segregated athletic teams. The ruling directly affects 2 states, but it reinforces similar restrictions in more than 24 others. 21 states still allowed transgender girls to compete on girls' teams, and the ruling leaves those protections intact. For now. Next, we head to Florida, where the legal fight over Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care continues. Federal Judge Robert Hinkle in the Northern District of Florida has repeatedly ruled that Florida's ban on Medicaid coverage for gender dysphoria treatments is unconstitutional and violates the federal Medicaid statute, the Affordable Care Act, and the Equal Protection Clause. That ruling, in the case Decker v. Wida, has been on appeal at the 11th Circuit, and as of July 2026, the appellate decision is still pending. Meanwhile, the state has continued to deny coverage, and the Trump administration has walked back a broader federal effort to withhold Medicare and Medicaid funds from hospitals that provide this care to minors. Our third story raises a fascinating contradiction inside the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced a new initiative to test all service members over 30 for low testosterone and to offer testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT, to those who want it. Federal Judge Anna Reyes, who is presiding over a lawsuit challenging the administration's ban on transgender troops, asked a pointed question. What exactly is the difference between offering testosterone therapy to cisgender troops and denying it to transgender troops? She ordered both sides to explain the medical and logistical differences. The transgender military ban remains in effect while litigation continues, but the judge's order highlights what critics are calling a clear double standard. Story 4 takes us to the world of professional tennis. Starting this week, the Women's Tennis Association is requiring a one-time mandatory genetic test for every player on tour. The test screens for the SRY gene, a segment of DNA typically found on the Y chromosome that signals male sex development. Players who test positive will be declared ineligible for women's competition. The WTA says the policy is designed to align with the International Olympic Committee's new eligibility rules ahead of the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. There are currently no known transgender women competing on the WTA tour, and human rights groups have criticized the policy as invasive and unnecessary. Track and field, skiing, and boxing already use similar tests. And finally, a story from Minnesota that has generated intense debate. Researchers at the University of Minnesota Medical School have developed something called My Gender Dolls. Paper dolls with over 100 swappable parts, including clothing, hairstyles, and detachable internal and external genitalia. They are designed for gender-diverse children ages 4 to 10 as a therapeutic play tool for clinicians and educators. The project, developed over 6 years by associate professors at the Eli Coleman Institute for Sexual and Gender Health, is scheduled to roll out in some Minnesota classrooms this fall. Supporters describe it as a developmentally appropriate therapeutic resource. Critics, including some pediatricians, have called it inappropriate for young children. The university has stated that no taxpayer money went to commercialization, though the broader program has received public support. So there you have it, 5 headlines, 5 very different fronts. The courts, the Pentagon, professional sports, and the classroom are all wrestling with the same underlying questions about biology, identity, and where policy should draw its lines. However you feel about any of these stories, the pace of change is undeniable. Thanks for watching. doesn't match Tim's deeply troubling chapter in the history of psychology and medicine, John Money and the development of gender theory. It's a topic that has had an enormous influence on medical practice, ethics, and our understanding of gender identity. As you'll hear today, it's also a story that reminds us how science evolves, how theories are tested and challenged, and how real people's lives are affected by the ideas we embrace. So, in Ellen's absence, let's take some time to look at the life, work, and legacy of John Money and the lessons his story continues to teach us. Before we begin, I'd also like to offer a brief content advisory. Today's discussion includes medical decisions involving children, non-consensual surgeries, childhood trauma, and suicide. While these topics are presented for educational purposes, some listeners may find them difficult. Today, we're looking at John Money, a psychologist whose ideas about gender identity profoundly influenced medicine for decades before being challenged by one of the most significant case studies in modern psychology. His story isn't simply about one man. It's about science. It's about ethics. And it's about the responsibility that comes with shaping the lives of others. I want to start with a question that seems simple on the surface, but gets complicated the longer you sit with it. What makes you, you? Not your name, not where you grew up, not even how other people see you, but something deeper. Your internal sense of who you are. Sit with that for a second, because most of us have never had to explain it. We've never had to defend it or prove it or justify it to a doctor. It's simply there. It's been there as long as we can remember. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to study. How do you measure something that a person experiences from the inside and that no instrument can see from the outside? For a long time, scientists believed that sense might not be as fixed as we think. That maybe, under the right conditions, it could be shaped, guided, even determined. It's worth pausing on how appealing that idea would have been. If identity can be shaped, then identity can be managed. And if it can be managed, then a difficult situation becomes a solvable problem. At the center of that idea was one man, John Money. And his work didn't just influence psychology, it shaped real medical decisions that affected children, families, and lives in permanent ways. That's the part I want you to hold on to as we go. This isn't a debate that stayed inside academic journals. It reached into operating rooms. It reached into families. And once those decisions were made, they could not be taken back. To understand this, we need to go back to the 1950s. And I want you to really try to picture it because the context matters enormously here. Imagine being a doctor at that time. You understand biology reasonably well, chromosomes, hormones, anatomy. You can describe what makes someone biologically male or female in clinical terms. You have textbooks, you have categories, you have language that feels precise. But then a child is born, and things don't fit neatly. Their anatomy doesn't match typical definitions. And all that medical certainty suddenly disappears. Because now you're not just asking, what is this child biologically? You're asking, who are they going to become? And that is a fundamentally different kind of question. The first one is a question about tissue and chromosomes. The second one is a question about a whole human life. There weren't clear answers. No long-term studies. No shared standards. No roadmap. Just uncertainty. And I think it's worth being honest about what uncertainty does to people, especially people in positions of authority. It's uncomfortable. It's exposing. When a frightened family is sitting in front of you asking what they should do, saying "we don't know yet" is one of the hardest things a clinician can say. So there was real pressure, professional, emotional, human pressure, for someone to step forward with an answer. And into that uncertainty stepped John Money, confident, articulate, and convinced he had figured out something others hadn't. Money believed something that at the time felt radical. That gender identity, the internal sense of being male, female, or something else, was not fully determined at birth. It could be shaped, especially early in life. He focused on a very specific window, the first 18 to 24 months. He believed that during this period, a child's sense of self was still forming, flexible, responsive. And if you raised a child consistently as one gender during that window, that identity would take hold. Raise a child as a boy, they become a boy. Raise a child as a girl, they become a girl. Not just in behavior, in identity. At least, that was the theory. Look at the three ideas on the screen and notice how they fit together. There's a window. There's an assumption that the child is malleable inside that window. And there's a predicted outcome, that consistent upbringing makes the identity permanent. Each piece depends on the one before it. Which means if any single link in that chain turns out to be wrong, the whole structure gives way. And it didn't sound unreasonable back then. If you're a parent facing uncertainty, you don't want ambiguity. You want a plan. And Money offered one. I want to be fair to the people in this story, because it's easy to look back with 70 years of hindsight and wonder how anyone believed this. But put yourself in that examination room. You're terrified. You love your child. And someone with credentials and confidence and an answer tells you there is a path forward. Most of us would want to believe him too. His approach became known as the optimal gender policy. It was built on a simple idea: decide early, be consistent, don't look back. First, assign a sex as soon as possible after birth. Second, if necessary, use surgery to align the body with that assignment. Third, raise the child in that role, fully and consistently. Clothing, language, expectations, social roles, everything reinforcing the same message. And fourth, no mixed signals, no uncertainty. Because in this model, consistency wasn't just helpful, it was essential. I want to slow down on that fourth step, because it's doing more work than it appears to. Never revisit is not only a piece of parenting advice, it's a rule that protects the theory itself. If you never revisit the decision and you never introduce doubt, then you also never create the conditions in which the child could tell you the decision was wrong. Secrecy stops being a side effect. It becomes part of the method. And notice what this policy asks parents and doctors to do. Make permanent decisions about a child before that child can weigh in. There's no step in this framework where you check back in. No step where you ask the person at the center of it how they're doing. No step where new information can change the course. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it.
Money also introduced language that we still use today. And this is the place where he genuinely deserves credit. He drew a distinction between gender role and gender identity. Gender role, the outward expression, how you dress, how you behave, what society expects of you. Gender identity, the internal sense of self. Before that distinction existed, those two things tended to get collapsed into a single idea. Separating them gave clinicians and researchers a vocabulary for something people had experienced for a very long time without having precise words for it. That distinction stuck, even as many of his broader conclusions were later challenged. That framework remained. He also talked about social imprinting, the idea that children absorb gender through repetition, through family, through school, through culture, through the thousand small signals they receive every day. And to be fair, that part holds up. Environment does shape behavior and expression. Any of us who have watched a small child study the adults around them and quietly copy what they see knows there's truth in it. But what Money proposed went further than that. He believed environment could override biology, that identity itself could be directed if you acted early enough. And that's the leap. There's a real difference between saying environment shapes how a person expresses who they are and saying environment determines who they are. The first is well supported. The second is a much bigger claim. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. He published widely. He spoke at conferences around the world. His ideas spread quickly. Hospitals adopted similar approaches to intersex and sex assignment cases. Medical students were taught his theories as part of the standard curriculum. By the late 1960s, John Money wasn't just influential. He was authoritative, the expert, the person people turned to for answers. And I think it's worth naming how that happens, because it isn't unique to this story. An idea gets published, it gets cited, the citation gets cited. It enters a textbook, students learn it as established fact rather than as a proposal still being tested. And somewhere along that path, a hypothesis quietly turns into a foundation, not because new evidence arrived, but because enough people repeated it. But under the surface, things weren't as stable as they appeared. Some patients didn't follow the expected path. Some families reported confusion instead of clarity. Some clinicians started to feel uneasy. And a question began to grow. What if this isn't the full picture? What if something else, something biological, plays a bigger role than we thought? At first, those doubts were quiet. And they stayed quiet for a reason. When a field has settled on an answer, the person raising a concern is the one who has to justify themselves. It's easier to assume you've misread your own case than to suggest the leading expert has misread his. But then came a case that would make those doubts impossible to ignore. To understand what happened next, we need to talk about a case. A single case that, at the time, seemed to prove Money's theory perfectly, until it didn't. Before we continue, I'd like to remind listeners that the next section contains discussion of childhood medical trauma, coercion, and suicide. These events are difficult, but they're central to understanding why this case became such an important turning point in medicine. This isn't a hypothetical, and it isn't a thought experiment. It's the life of a real person with a real family, and I want us to treat it that way.
David Reimer and his identical twin brother Brian were born in Winnipeg, Manitoba in 1965. Two ordinary Canadian boys. At 6 months of age, the twins were scheduled for circumcision using an unconventional method, electrocautery. During the procedure, David's penis was irreparably damaged. Brian's procedure was never performed. Just one accident, one child. And I want to pause there for a moment, because everything that follows flows from a single moment, in a single room. Two identical boys walked into that hospital. Only one of them was harmed. The parents were devastated. They didn't know what to do. Eventually, in early 1967, they took David to John Money, a leading gender researcher at Johns Hopkins. From the parents' perspective, this was hope. From Money's perspective, this was something else, a chance to test his theory in a way that had never been done before, with an identical twin as a built-in control. Those two perspectives, sitting in the same room at the same appointment, is the tension at the heart of this entire story. Money recommended gender reassignment. Surgeons removed David's testes and what remained of his penis and constructed rudimentary female genitals. He was renamed Brenda and raised as a girl. During adolescence, Brenda was given estrogen to promote female sex characteristics. And crucially, she was never told she was biologically male. Think about what that means, day to day, over years. A child growing up with the persistent sense that something doesn't fit, and no information available anywhere in her world that would explain why. In 1980, when David was 15, his father finally told him the truth. In that moment, everything shifted. He rejected the assigned identity, resumed living as male, and took the name David. By 21, David had received testosterone therapy, undergone breast removal, and had reconstructive surgery. He was rebuilding a life. On May 2nd, 2004, David's wife told him she wanted a divorce. 2 days later, at age 38, he died by suicide.
To understand why this case matters ethically, not just scientifically, you have to understand what was actually happening inside those sessions with Money. And this is where the story gets very hard. As part of the research, David and his twin brother Brian were directed to inspect one another and rehearse sexual positions. Money justified this as the rehearsal of healthy childhood sexual exploration.
In a Rolling Stone interview, David said Money photographed at least one of these sessions. He said Money observed them alone and on occasion with as many as 6 colleagues present. When David or his brother resisted, David recalled anger and verbal abuse, which stood in sharp contrast to the calm, scientific demeanor Money presented to their parents. That contrast matters. It tells you the parents were not seeing what their children were experiencing. They were handing their sons to someone they had been told was the leading expert in the world, and they had no way of knowing what happened once the door closed. David later described the sessions as torturous and abusive. He said they left him with a lifelong distrust of hospitals and medical professionals, and that consequence deserves its own moment. A person who cannot trust doctors carries that for the rest of their life, into every illness, every injury, every appointment they avoid. The harm didn't end when the sessions ended. This is what was happening while Money was publishing his case as a triumph.
For years, Money said the reassignment worked. He published the case, famously under the name the John Joan case, keeping David's real name out of the record. He described Brenda as well-adjusted, as girlish, in stark contrast to her brother Brian's boyishness. And the scientific world believed him. The case appeared in textbooks and research papers. According to biographers and the Intersex Society of North America, Money's theories and this case were used to justify thousands of sex reassignment surgeries on children with atypical or damaged genitals. I want to make sure that number registers, because it's easy to let it slide past. Thousands. This is not one theory affecting one family. It became the basis for a standard of care. But the real story wasn't happening in academic journals. It was happening in a child's life. And it looked very different. David later said he experienced severe gender dysphoria from a very early age. He told his parents at one point that if they made him go back to Money, he would kill himself. Sit with that, a child saying that about a medical appointment. Despite the estrogen, despite the dresses, despite being steered toward what were considered typically female interests, he said he always felt that he was a boy. At 15, when his father finally told him the truth, he returned to living as male. Look at those 2 columns on the screen side by side. The same years, the same child, 2 completely different accounts. One of them was published, taught, and built upon. The other was simply lived. For decades, though, no one outside the family knew. The success of the John Joan case sat unchallenged in the literature.
Then, in the mid-1990s, David crossed paths with a man named Milton Diamond, a psychologist at the University of Hawaii, and an academic rival of Money's. Diamond conducted a follow-up study with David. And this time, the story that came out looked nothing like the one Money had published. Diamond cataloged the failures of the transition, in detail, on the record. It's worth noticing what it actually took for the truth to surface. Not a routine review, not a system that checked its own results. It took a rival, decades later, going and asking the patient directly. Then in December 1997, David went public. He gave an interview to Rolling Stone. He would later collaborate on a book about his life, and in his own words, he described what Money had done to him, not as a treatment, but as torture and abuse. Consider what that required of him. He had spent his childhood being examined, photographed, and written about by other people. Going public meant choosing, as an adult, to tell the story himself.
in his own words, under his own name. In 1990, David married a single mother of 3. In his early 20s, he attempted suicide twice. There were struggles with employment, marital strain. Then, in 2002, his twin brother Brian, who had lived alongside him through all of this, died of an antidepressant overdose. And 2 years after that, David's own life ended, at 38. John Money died in 2006. According to colleagues, he was privately mortified by the David Reimer case. In public, he did not discuss it.
Once the full story came out, the criticisms of Money's work fell into 3 broad categories: scientific, empirical, and ethical. Scientific. The theory overstated how much early socialization could shape gender identity. It underestimated biological influences, and it rested on weak or selective evidence. Empirical. The conclusions weren't supported by the actual outcomes. Cases like David Reimer's contradicted the claim that early upbringing alone determines identity. And this is where you see the danger of a case study presented as proof. A single case can illustrate an idea beautifully. What it cannot do is establish that the idea is generally true, especially when the person reporting the case is also the person whose theory is being tested. And ethical. The clinical approach emphasized early surgery and strict social assignment before children could consent. Later commentators argued this caused real harm and that it treated children as experimental subjects. That phrase deserves emphasis. Not patients receiving treatment, subjects in an experiment without their knowledge and without the ability to say no. So the criticism isn't just that he was wrong, it's that he was wrong in a way that affected real children and their families permanently. Being wrong is an ordinary part of science. It's how the process works. What makes this different is that the cost of being wrong was paid by people who never agreed to carry it. In short, the theory has been criticized as too deterministic, too confident, and too light on both evidence and ethics. Too deterministic. It treated something as complex as human development as if it could be managed by a formula. Raise them consistently, and identity will follow. Human beings rarely cooperate with formulas that clean. Too confident. The public certainty ran ahead of the underlying data, and doubts from clinicians and families were slow to reshape the theory. And confidence is persuasive in a way that careful, hedged language simply isn't. A clear answer delivered with authority will almost always outrun a cautious one delivered with humility, even when the cautious one is closer to the truth. Too light on evidence. Selective reporting of outcomes and limited long-term follow-up meant the theory was less well supported than its influence suggested. And notice how those two problems feed each other. If you don't follow up over the long term, the disconfirming evidence never reaches you. Your theory looks stronger than it is, precisely because you stopped looking. And too light on ethics. Irreversible decisions were made on children before they could consent. That's a serious problem in any framework, in any era, under any theory. So where does that leave the science?
Today, the understanding of gender identity is very different. Most researchers no longer see it as something shaped by just one factor, not purely biology, not purely environment, but a combination. Biology, hormones, brain development, early experience, social context, all interacting, all influencing. Not a simple formula, a complex system. And I'd argue that's a sign of maturity rather than a retreat. It's less satisfying than a clean answer. It's harder to put on a slide, but it's a great deal closer to how human beings actually work. And medicine has changed too. There's more caution now, more emphasis on listening, more awareness that some decisions, especially irreversible ones, shouldn't be made too early. Because identity isn't always predictable, and people deserve a say in decisions that affect their bodies and their lives. Some of that change came from research, but a meaningful part of it came from patients. People who lived through these protocols and who spoke up afterward about what they had experienced. That's worth acknowledging. The correction didn't only come from inside the profession. It came from the people the profession had been practicing on. So where does that leave John Money? Not as a simple villain, and not as a hero, but as something more complicated. A figure who helped shape an important conversation and also showed what can happen when confidence moves ahead of evidence. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I think it's important to resist collapsing them. He gave the field vocabulary it still uses. He also caused profound harm. Holding both is uncomfortable, but it's more honest than choosing one and discarding the other. Science doesn't move in straight lines. It moves through ideas, through testing, through mistakes, through revision, and sometimes through stories like this one. Stories that force us to stop and reconsider what we think we know. The revision is supposed to be part of the process. What went wrong here wasn't that someone proposed a theory that turned out to be mistaken. It's that the theory was protected from correction for decades, while the person best positioned to correct it was never asked. Influence doesn't equal truth. Authority doesn't guarantee accuracy. What matters is evidence, transparency, and respect for the people whose lives are affected. Evidence. Claims should be tied to observable, repeatable, transparent data, not to the confidence of the person making them. How sure someone sounds tells you about them. It tells you nothing about whether they're right. Transparency. Findings and outcomes should be reported honestly, including the ones that contradict the theory being tested. Especially those. The results that don't fit are the most valuable ones you'll ever collect, and they're the easiest ones to leave out. And respect. Behind every theory are real human experiences. The people affected deserve consent, dignity, and a voice. In this story, the single most reliable source of information about whether the treatment was working was David himself. He knew. He said so repeatedly from a very young age. And for most of his life, no one with the authority to act treated what he said as data.
Behind every theory, there are real human experiences. And those experiences don't always follow the script. If there's one thing I hope stays with you from this episode, it's that. Not the dates, not the terminology, but the reminder that the people at the center of our theories are the ones who know most about whether those theories are true. And that listening to them is not a courtesy. It's part of the science. Thank you for spending this time with us. Ellen will be back with us next week. If you found this episode helpful or thought-provoking, you can follow the podcast for more deep dives into topics like this one. And as always, thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves.